Hey, everybody. Hey, friends. Today, we're going to talk about mysticism. What is mysticism? Why mysticism? What are the different types of mysticism? And what's the prime mysticism, which is, of course, Christian mysticism, and also talking about Christian Hermeticism, which is very important for this. But again, these things are done by the saints and priests. Hermeticism is just a vocation within the wider church, though it is esoteric. So, not everyone will agree. But let us go into what we're going to talk about today. I'll open up a little presentation, and you should be able to see it there. Good. So, what is mysticism? We're also going to talk about the phenomenology of it. And I speak now from direct experience in all this. So only some of what we say is going to be connected with Valentin Tomberg, who was a Christian esotericist, and Rudolf Steiner. But really, almost all of it I've gone through. So it's to do, and these are the most deep and profound things you can experience. What is mysticism? It's a direct relationship with God as a mystical fact, as a fact of your being, as even to the point of physical interaction. But it's often characterized by spiritual touch. And so the mystic develops sensory things that were rendered unconscious since the fall are reconnected. You could call it the wings of the will that are reconnected, but you're not grasping. It's in collaboration. And so that's... what else? How else can I put it? The why. Why? Why do it? Because there's no greater meaning, no greater depth in the world at all than this. It's the most deep and meaningful thing you can experience, is to have God walk with you, as the Bible puts it, to walk with God. But also to experience episteme, which is a word that is basically related to the truth, but not as moderns understand it, like epistemology, the criterion of truth, and all our rationality arguments, which are related to inference. Inference is a form of knowledge certainty, but it's indirect and will only ever reach a certain level. But episteme, the true depth of episteme that's granted, is the certainty of faith. It's the certainty of having divine knowledge and the divine being with you, but sent in directly into your understanding as if really that's the language of angels. It's the direct transmission into the depths of your being as truth, which generates that intrinsic certainty or infused certainty. That's why. Because you're always looking for another book or someone else to tell you the truth about something. But if you want the whole truth, unquestionable, unshakable certainty, as a mystical fact or as eyewitness certainty, but also even deeper than that, because it's a deeper version than eyewitness certainty, as we'll talk more about. That's what mysticism is. But in terms of the ground mysticism, it's a point. It's touch. It's deeper. Like I said, it's deeper than knowledge. It's deeper. It's the deepest level of understanding and the deepest level of touch. But like I said, as a mystical fact, as a and a permanent fact of experience that can't be taken away. The sense that you can do anything with God, and the sense that you can endure anything for God. So the certainty of the hero, the holy hero and martyr, with the theurgist, the person that can do sacred magic. But the charlatan is, that's, and we'll go into this later, but I've got here, yes, the grace and revelatory action of knowing. So movements and direct collaboration with the divine being. Again, as a fact of existence, not just something you see or feel, but something you collaborate with directly. And so the metaphysician, the philosopher, the academic, and all these people that repeat philosophy of someone else online are not philosophers in the true sense of the word. Even theologians talked about this, about theology. Just repeating theology, true theology is to experience it and talk about it, not just to do rationality, not just to do inference and logic and argument. That's needed. We're not saying that doesn't exist. It's also part of the wider Christian Hermeticist approach. That is needed. But this deep level is beyond that. And the old theologians, the church fathers, all these people, they had this raw experience of the truth. That's true theology. Mysticism is the ground of religion. Before it becomes tradition, that mysticism, gnosis, magic, or the miraculous, it precedes philosophy. To be capable of, and to know. To be capable of is magic. YHVH. But let's move on to the next part. So there's 3 types of mysticism. And this is where we'll get into the difference between... have I got the screen cap on? Yeah, I do. Good. There are 3 types of mysticism. Nature mysticism, human mysticism, or humanist mysticism, and divine mysticism. The last being a synthesis of the other 2, which is Christian mysticism. Nature mysticism can be characterized as, say, you've got the subject and the object, which we'll have a diagram of later. The subject, it blurs the lines between the subject and the object. It dissolves the lines between those 2 things. It doesn't get to the ground of both those 2 things, the essence of both those 2 things. It just divides the dividing line between them. So that's described by the sociologist Lévi-Breux, who was also someone that Carl Jung quoted often, and his concept of participation mystique, which means participation meaning you're not one, you're part of an organism. And so really, nature mysticism is Dionysian. It can be characterized by intoxication. And that participation is temporal. So those who take DMT, those who do ayahuasca, I know there's that chap who I like a lot, is who does that Church of the Eternal Logos. He did that, and he actually came to Christ that way. He's extremely lucky. And obviously he now says, don't do that. Now he's an Orthodox Christian. But he's extremely lucky that he interacted with something from the eternal, because that is, anything from temporality could get involved with you doing that. And mistruths can be transmitted to you doing that. So you'd be extremely lucky to have something from the eternal outside temporality that would communicate with you with nature mysticism. And so that's connected with the Dionysian. It's the intoxication of Dionysian orgies and Kundalini. It's the broad way. This is the broad way, whereas the Christian mysticism is the narrow way. And the humanist mysticism is the abandonment way, which we'll get into. And so yeah, Broadway as in nature mysticism doesn't cleanse you. Nature mysticism just heightens what you are. You could say it blurs the lines between both of them. It's not cleansing the subject. It's not healing and resurrecting the subject. It's not even the sobriety of humanist mysticism and humanist, like the Buddhists and the yogis go through, which can be characterized by sobriety. Nature mysticism is, again, being the broad way. If someone did hatha yoga and kundalini, they're lifting up, which is sacrilege and incredibly dangerous. It's without morally purifying yourself, without dissolving. You're just lifting up and mixing the things that you are. So both illusions from both sides can affect you in that. So it's not recommended, nature mysticism, and is dangerous. But that doesn't mean it's not involved with what we're talking about. Like I said, it's to do with the object and blurring that line. But it's not the essence. It's not getting to the essence. And so the second one is humanist mysticism. Like we said, it's characterized by sobriety. And this could be considered, this mysticism is the mysticism of the yogis, which is, and also you could characterize it as that of the Buddhists now as well. It's a humanist thing. You could consider it as it is the separation of the empirical subject from the transcendent self, but it's depersonalization. It's the like I said, it's the abandonment of. That's why it's considered an illusion. But the problem with this is it doesn't access the divine, which we'll go into. But yeah, the way of depersonalization is kind of it's a checking out. It's a checking out from, hang on, you can't see that. It is a legitimate ecstasy, meaning an outer bodiness, but it's the dissolution of consciousness, not of being. And so that's why it becomes considered as a illusion. And a dissolution of that to dwell in nirvana, which is peace. But that's only the basic level of the divine. Even the breath that's just above it is still not, as the Vedanta says, which is still profound, but it's profound in a humanist way, in that they're right on the edge. It talks about the edge of the experience of the breath of these forces coming in and not knowing where they come from, which is true of the spirit. But what happens and can be characterized by this, like I said, is sobriety. But what happens is it's the depersonalization, but also God is removed from the equation. After this process, God's not necessary. What happens is the transcendent self is God, is what the yogis think. That's in terms of, because it's human mysticism on its own, it deals with the subject and going to the ground of the subject. And we'll get to the third one in just a sec. I just have to go to the bathroom. Bad timing. Okay. And so the third type is divine mysticism, which is a synthesis of both those two things. And we'll go into the details of that divine mysticism. But it can be characterized by love. It's not depersonalization. So you don't lose the subject. You don't lose the likeness and the image of God. It's not annihilated, but we'll go into the detail of that. But you can see here from this image of the chariot, we can talk about the dangers of mysticism and what mastery protects you from. Really, which are the three temptations that you're protected from in mastery, or it really deals with the fourth temptation, which is this megalomania, which is this which can be characterized as a big problem, I think, of the East. What happened with the East is they technicalized a lot of their spiritual practices. They become the master. Whereas in this, as we'll go into, in this divine mysticism, the master is always above you and always collaborates with you. It's not something that becomes you and then you create a bunch of practices like Wim Hof and teach breathing practices to people who then just have it as a technology in their brain. Those are thieves and robbers, as the Lord said, as the Master said. But in terms of the meaning of this, you can see this man rides on a chariot. Where's my cursor? I don't know if you'd be able to see that. Maybe you can. It's all right. He rides on a chariot. He's standing. He's not in ecstasy. Parts of his being are. But he's not checked out. He's not abandoning consciousness. He's consciousness, yet he's in union at the same time. He's holding a scepter, which is divine will, with a purified human will, collaboratively. He wears a crown. That's divine will. He has a breastplate. That's sobriety. So he's both at the same time, the subject and the object, nature mysticism and human mysticism at the same time. But to the ground of both of them, which you can guess is the Logos. And so he's protected by the breastplate from intoxication. He has sobriety, but not sobriety on its own. He has the life of God by going to the ground and the essence of the creation. Therefore, he has God with him as the divine person. And that protects him. Those three things protect him from, because he does the synthesis, that protects him from megalomania, exaltation, which is the problem of J mysticism, which I'm not really going to go into today. But that is one other problem, which is that on its own, without the synthesis of the personal and acknowledging the incarnation. And like I said, megalomania and rage. So they're the three things that, and this, you can get a lot more out of this. Also the canopy. So with that synthesis, you're protected from the problems of the other two. But now, let's go into the yogic in detail. And we just sort of talked about a bit of that in terms of the problem. This is the problem with human mysticism on its own, which is the ultimate, which is sobriety, but also the broad way, which could be connected with a bit of nature mysticism as well. So as is talked about in Christianity, the broad way is, the narrow way is that of collaboration with the Lord. You could consider that as the purification and removal of what is evil, to leave the good of the person. So the non-likeness that you are becomes the likeness of God and the image of God. And so you still have those things intact. Now, if you think about this from the humanist perspective, and this is the thieves and robbers quote, those that came before me are thieves and robbers, which has two meanings. I'll go into the esoteric one later. But for the humanist mysticism, you could consider it the removal of consciousness, the removal of the good and bad. So the depersonalization, the image, the likeness, and the not, well, it's not just a removal of the non-likeness, it's the elimination of the likeness too. So they consider it to be the dissolution of being, but no, it's the dissolution of the person, because the person is divine. And you can see in the happening of this is why they ended up with the mistake of considering the transcendent self is God. That is a kind of megalomania to consider that. And you can see why then from that megalomania that the spiritual practices become technologies. We in the West technicalized our propositions and our rational thinking, but even worse, in the East, they technicalized their practices. So they're kind of like Ubermensches in a way, but not in the sense that they lift up the will to power, the broad way. That some of them are broad way, but in terms of the yogis, you have to give them credit for at least they have sobriety. They do. It's a genuine ecstasy, but it's the elimination of. and being a thief and a robber is the destruction of the personality, and the personality is divine, as we know from theology. Like, God is a divine person. And so what happens to the yogis is that what's removed from that for them is an experience of things that are above the transcendent self. So there's no revelation. They may have wisdom. The wisdom of the world might be granted to them, which is like what the philosophers are able to access through their depersonalization. They did depersonalization too. But that comes from the object. That comes from going down to the ground of reflectivity, which is Sophia, philosophia. That does happen, but it is, again, it's depersonalization. You can see that in the technicalization of Plato, even Plato talking about love as the good. It's still in there, but they were close at least. I think the Hermeticism was closer than the rest of it because of the understanding of the good. But yeah, the yogis. So you have to give them that at least. I'm not saying, it's not evil, it's just humanist. But it can lead to problems and one of the problems is that it was Luciferic in the sense that seeking nirvana, there was no value in their culture for revelation, for saving the world, which comes later with Christ. It was inherited later from Christianity. I think there are some parts of it now that have that as a value in Buddhism. But that's post-Christianity, and it comes from Christianity. But not even just coming, the truth of reality is Christian. But, yeah, so anything that happens after Christ's incarnation, you'll see that even if it came from some sort of revelation, it's coming from Christ, the cosmic Logos. And so that depersonalization. And so you could call it the way of abandonment. But this isn't what this diagram is saying. Hatha yoga isn't what we're talking about. That's just one part. The Kundalini is one. That's the broad way. We're talking about abandonment here when we're talking about human mysticism. But it is important to have it there and talk about it. But yeah, so they don't experience the 9 hierarchies, which are above that. All the saints. These are all mystical facts of being. Mary. These gods, the practice should, or if you do it in Christian mysticism, give you access to these beings. As Rudolf Steiner talks about, as all that the saints talk about, as Valentin Tomberg talks about, that is not available to them. And to understand better what depersonalization is, losing the ability to cry, it's the removal of the good and bad. And so that's a known thing. Yogis don't have the gift of tears. And with that, we could talk about, we'll talk about that next. And so with that understanding, the tears, paraphrasing Christ as he says, I came so you'd have life abundantly, not to have it eliminated. And you can see here too in this diagram a kind of summary of everything we've been talking about. Enstasy, ecstasy, but also you can see I've drawn little circles at the bottom of S and O. O is object, S is subject, and I've got the ground of both those two things as essence, and then an arrow in the middle saying synthesis of those two things as Christian union. And the Logos, of course, is the ground of both of those things, the heart of the world and the cosmic heart. Sorry, the cosmic heart and the sacred heart, and he's at the ground of you, the image and likeness of God. And so Christian mysticism is both of these things at the same time. It's the ground of the subject and the ground of the object. And like I said, as Christ says, I came so you'd have life abundantly. He's not there to take away your emotions. He's not there to take away what moves you. He's to add the ultimate depth of all those things. But also with revelation to protect you from bad things. And so Christian mysticism has the gift of tears. You don't have an ecstasy where you're disconnected from consciousness. You have union with God in full consciousness, gnostically and mystically. You have divine revelation. You have interaction with the 9 hierarchies. Like I said at the start of the stream, a direct mystical fact of being, but you're conscious when it happens. You can also experience an out-of-bodiness, and we'll go into that later, the difference between Christian ecstasy and the yogic ecstasy, which is a heightening of the intellect, really. But we'll go into that soon. But the point is, you have this duality, but it's not dualism and it's not monism. It's love. Because love presupposes what is loved and someone who loves and the loving in the middle, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Also two. So two, you could think about it like two substances, one ultimate essence, which is God. And so what else can we characterize there? That's right. I think I already sort of mentioned a bit of that. But so the person exists, but he's cleansed of sin and evil. So the likeness isn't just an illusion to check out of. Oh, it's just an illusion. Let's just dwell in emptiness. Like the Zen preacher, the Zen meditant or the Buddhist. And again, these are useful, good humanist things in their own way. But it's again, depersonalization. They help people with the pain of life. But Buddha's characterization was that life is pain. And his solution was to have this as a way of getting out of it, rather than saving it. And so the Christian way, being a synthesis of both these two things, gets to the essence of both of them. And that's characterized in initiation and the practices that I've got videos. Go to the front of my YouTube page and you'll see the very beginning of the practices of initiation. I've got a list of videos there that you can actually start. And I can attest to you that it becomes a fact of your being, incontestable. And the most deeply moving thing you'll ever have in your life, more than any experience in temporality, is this mysticism. But it's very specific too, as we'll go into. It's not a mysticism on its own. True mysticism includes gnosis, includes magic or the miraculous, these different senses, Y, H, V, and H. There's 4 different senses, and we'll go into that, that make up Christian Hermeticism, which means you're not a spiritual drunkard, but we'll go into that. And so, yes, the Christian union is about the difference in initiation before and after Christ. Since Christ came and redeemed karma, the way of initiation is different. Sort of the pagan initiations were done by outside forces. They were done by the people, the actual priests aided in doing that, rather than an initiation that can just happen with a direct collaboration. So there's no going back. There's no going back to, let's go back to an old paganism to try and initiate. It's just pointless. There's no way. You have to go, you can't reach past Christ. And this comes to the esoteric meaning of that quote. Those that came before me were thieves or are thieves and robbers. I think it's are, which means still now, are, right? Because Christ is the I am, that I am. He's contemporaneous and eternal with all temporality. He's outside time. That also considers the grade of initiation. The grade of initiation meaning those who, here's Christ, you follow him. Those who reached before me to get to the Father and the divine, meaning they under their own steam, not collaboratively, right? So you're reaching past the Logos at the ground of your being, and you're thieving and robbing and considering yourself master, Übermensch, right? And so you lose the ability to collaborate with him. You become depersoned because you're a thief and a robber. So it means before as an initiate too. And you're losing access to God, and you enter a kind of Luciferic megalomania. The transcendent self is God, which the yogis say, which is I think it's even in the Vedanta, or I can't remember which book it is. That was their conclusion. There are some other, Sankhya, I think it's called. That's more philosophical. They don't make the conclusion that the transcendent self is God, but they also don't make claims about gods either. So it's considered a kind of atheism, I think. They think about it like that. But they don't make the claim. So it's not all of them. But you can see how that leads to the technicalization too, is that if you consider yourself master, you then create this piece of knowledge disconnected from the divine, and that becomes this artifact that's used, but it's just bark. It's not connected to the roots. You need these things to be connected to the root. They're ways, but in collaboration. In Christian mysticism, you're always collaborating. The mysteries, and I'm not sure how much I should talk about, because there are some things, especially for the people that start this process, is that there's such deep and meaningful things interacting with the Lord in a very real way. He enters the blood. Christ enters the blood. Real physical movements. I don't want to talk too much about it because these are for you to discover. But also the collaborative control of the breath, which is related to what Rudolf Steiner talks about with the trial of air. And that's the ability of using the active and the passive to allow to silence your own volition and will, so another will can guide your breathing, let's say. Which is why Kundalini is so sacrilegious, and Wim Hof method that stuff is so sacrilegious and dangerous, because that's what temperance is. Temperance is your guardian angel. What's temperance? If the Lord is controlling your breath, he knows how much to breathe. If there is this increase in breath, that's what it involves. You don't know. Your technique doesn't know. That's why it's dangerous. It's the broad way. The narrow way is threading the eye of the needle in collaboration with a very real divine being. And even after the union and the actualization of the transcendent self in esoteric terminology, there, of course, are other transcendent selves, saints, spiritual beings, of course, ultimately under Christ and Mary and God, but that possibility is eliminated for people who go the way of humanism and yogiism. So, moving on. And so going into a bit more detail, what is Enstasy and Ecstasy? Enstasy is the microcosm subject. Again, we're still dealing with this diagram. Enstasy is what's called the Hermetic Initiation. Again, this is all under different names done by monks and such, which we'll go into. It's just this is the names from esoteric Christianity, Christian Hermeticism. And so Enstasy deals with going to the depths of your being. Carl Jung did this. I think he might have also done ecstasy with the Pythagorean initiation. But these two different things are done in synthesis, Enstasy and ecstasy. But just to understand, as we talked about before, the nature mysticism doesn't go to the depths of either one. Well, the object is the heights. The depths are the depths of the psyche is a better way of thinking about it, but on the vertical. So Enstasy is alchemy. It's what the alchemists did. They go to the ground of being to discover the transcendent self, which is at the edge of, or nested in, the outside, which is outside temporality. Every time I say outside, it means outside temporality. A chap in Discord, one of our members, used the term atemporal. That's pretty good. But people might not understand that. So let's just say outside temporality, the eternal. Also, the eternal doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, but saying outside temporality does. So that's Enstasy. It's the microcosm. And what's at the ground of the microcosm? The Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ. And this structure didn't exist in the way it does now in pagan times. So that's why the pagan initiations don't work. And why the pagans go to the yogis to try to find a way, and or the Buddhist way to try to find a way that way, because the pagan mysteries won't work. And it's true. The Oracle of Delphi said in her last things that my wells have run dry. That happened since Christ came. Beings changed. Even Carl Jung discovers that in his analysis of the unconscious, that Christ is, he knows that Christ is at the ground of the unconscious. That wasn't the case before in pagan times. It doesn't have the same structure as it does now, because different things have happened, because Christ has come and redeemed karma, because he's done these things in the macrocosm. And so, yeah, that's Enstasy. And you get there through concentration without effort. Again, you can go to my homepage to discover the practices that make that possible. It's a long process, though. It's not something that comes about straight away, but it can be characterized as Carl Jung's individuation as well. And so ecstasy is the object. It's going to what's also called the Pythagorean initiation. And Pythagorean initiation, once you could consider it in Christian initiation, which is a synthesis of both these things. You could consider it when you're deep in your Enstasy, you reach a boundary, say an hour into your meditative prayers, and what Pythagoras described as the music of the spheres, which are angels, not spheres, that is a phenomenology of what occurs. And their ground is the true music, which is this deep depth of emotion, which are not like normal emotions. They're very complex, and it's a sense, like vision. And as definite and as unique and endlessly developed in Christian mysticism, to the point where you can notice the difference between this tiny difference in that emotiveness to identify different identities, different angels. So, and there is a phenomenology that goes with those depths, which I might talk about today, but maybe at a different time. And so you hear that music, and at the ground of that music is a certainty, which I'll talk about later. It comes along with a certainty that it's not you because of what it is, because it's the object. And we'll go into what that type of spiritual experience is in a few slides. But yeah, this microcosm, its entity is characterized by mystical touch that we talked about earlier. But yeah, let's move on to the next slide. I think you get that. So now let's talk about, this is kind of connected with intuition or Bergsonian intuition, but just the different ways of leaving the intellect, which is ecstasy. So, like we said earlier, the Zen Buddhist and the yogi end up abandoning consciousness, though they consider it a dissolution of being. That's not what happens, though, because it has to be a synthesis of these two things for that to occur. And so you could characterize theirs as a abandonment. But in terms of Christian mysticism, there is also an ecstasy where you can completely leave your body, and I've experienced this. It's the silence of all faculties. That is characterized by replacement, as replacement. With the good, though, with revelation, with the divine, not as an elimination, not as a abandonment, but a replacement. Or, and this is based on your decision, some people want to do away with the old being that they are, and saints quite rightly make that decision to completely do that. But then you no longer have the ability to deal with particular intellectual things. You are Jesus then, when you're like completely all 7 lotus flowers, as the esotericists call it, or faculties, higher faculties of being, are in repose of the Lord, are the Lord. When you're a saint, usually a Hermeticist keeps the ones that are related to the intellect intact, so they can deal with what is of value to the multiplicity that we are, or personal issues, rather than replacing. But there's a difference between abandoning and replacing. What the yogis go through is a returning to the prenatal state, basically, rather than being filled with what God has intended for them, and as a repose of Jesus and higher beings, with the ability to communicate with them and to receive revelatory action for the future. It's like a blank slate for them in a different way. And so the Hermeticist, he has those things active. So he works in collaboration with, while this resurrection occurs and the foot washing occurs, let's say, he still has his intellect, but the ecstasy happens in a different way. The will and the feeling go out, whereas you still have thoughts. So I've experienced complete ecstasy, out of bodiness, or complete blackness. But for the Hermeticist, it's not dealing with replacement, it's about collaboration, and leaving those faculties intact so they can do stuff like this, so they can talk about it and do. But there can be a mix of both. You see with St. John of the Cross, he was very intellectual about his mysticism and about his experiences and ecstasies and out-of-bodiness being. And so you can see there another characterization of what the difference is between the Christian one and the yogi one is, one, like I said, being in abandonment and being in nothingness, or nirvana. The Christian goes through an overactiveness of intelligence rather than a elimination of the person, which means after the ecstasy, they come back with revelations. So that overactiveness is a transformation of the ground of your being while you're doing that. Being in the presence of God's goodness makes you dark because it's raised to such a high level of intensity. But again, the difference is because it's overactive, not underactive, it's not a replacement, it's what comes after is revelation, as revelatory action, as divine, as the miraculous, as vision, and the different elements of the Gnostic sense come after that. But again, you can have parts of your being ecstasy, out of body, or move away from you. The will, for instance, that's basically a raising of your angelic wings, you could call it, which are contemplative and executory, meaning divine action can come through them and contemplation, revelation can come through them. And so that's what happened. Valentin Tomberg describes St. John of the Cross's dark night of the soul, that he seems to think that he's talking about what's going on with the will rather than consciousness. And that's, you can see that in the book Meditations on the Tarot. He talks about that. So, but that makes sense. From my experience of mysticism, yes, because these things happen at the same time, the will and other parts of your unconscious leave and are out of body, let's say, while consciousness is intact. So Anyway, let's move on to the next thing. Okay. Went down the wrong way. Okay. So now we come to another arcana, another symbol. And as we know, when you interpret symbols, something in you reaches beyond them to outside temporality if they are, like these are, connected with something that's eternal. Because these emerge. They emerge in the Middle Ages. Oh, sorry, the medieval period. No, Middle Ages. They emerged as a compression, not a compression, as a mediator of things that were known to the people of that time as arcana, and they reach beyond themselves. So when we look at this high priestess, we get a sense of the different elements that make up Christian Hermeticism, which is mysticism, but it's not just mystic touch that's involved with that, with spiritual touch. It's YHVH. It's 4 different senses: mystic, Gnostic, miraculous or magic, and Hermetic philosophical. And so those 4 things come together for a complete certainty of knowledge, but also with faith at the same time. So when we look at this diagram, at the top, it's 3 rings and a book. There's a point at the top. That's the yod, or mystic touch. The second one is the hay, yod hay, vau hay. Second one is that, which is Gnostic. The receptive principle, water. Yod is the spirit. And in this way, you're baptized by both, as the Lord says, baptized in water and spirit. I can't remember the exact quote. And then the magic one, which is the child of the first 2, of the receptive and the effective, of the receptive and the spirit, Yod and Hay, the effective cause, the divine breath, and then the receptive, which is Mary Sophia. And so the child of those 2 is magic. Now, what is the sense that's related to the second one? That is characterized as vision, or spiritual hearing. So you have, as I've talked about before, the receptive principle in you. And as I can't remember the philosopher that talked about that, but when you don't have a mind picture that's filled with the vision of the world, and this happens when you do the practices, being eventually disappears in collaboration with your eyes closing, but you could keep your eyes closed and then see your factical experience of the world disappear. You're left with a blank receptive principle that's part of your being. And of course, you are a projection of that divine name as the image and likeness of God. So you have these same principles with you. And so you have that water, and you have that faculty too. And I've talked about that as active imagination before. You might notice it if you're looking at a grey wall as a sort of static. When the images of the outer world are not with you, you should be able to... It becomes the Gnostic sense. But you have to... All these different practices only come through if you push each sense to its essence. If you through concentration without effort, which is a meditation, and you need to do these exercises every day, plus the 3 O's, which I'm not going to go into right now. But when you do these things, each one becomes active, but you have to actually be active in each of them for the ability to come about. And so that Gnostic sense can be considered vision, hearing. But the point of it is it's about distance. It's not direct touch, spiritual touch, it's spiritual hearing. And so but spiritual hearing is also characterized by sight. And so when you're in a practice and you feel mystically, because that point of Yod is a point of potentiality, it's got within it the Gnostic and the magical, the other things, as potentiality. And you can see that in the letter Yod in the Hebrew alphabet has within it the same shape of the Hey and the Vow in a little version of it. Now, I'm not going to bring it up now, but the point is it's in potentiality. And so those things are together when they're first observed mystically. And what that really means is that mystic touch is the fruits of your spirit or deeper levels of your unconscious, which are reaching out, and your soul or your soul faculties experience it as the fruits of that interaction. You're not directly experiencing it. You're getting the fruits of that as mystic touch. That's why it's invisible. And so Gnostic is secondary. After that, mystic sense, mystic touch, then you'll have it in active imagination as well. So you'll have both of these things at the same time, especially in Christian mysticism, because it's a synthesis, like I said, of the two things, of the object and the subject, ecstasy and enstasy. You're not depersonalizing. You'll both see and also touch at the same time. And so the magic sense is what happens after that. It's the child of those two things. It's the son of those two things. So the miraculous that occurs after, or the direct interactions with Christ in you mystically through collaboration. That could be with the breath. Again, what the scepter means in the blood, physically, once you reach that point. Also visions later when you're not in a practice, let's say. And so the book is the final synthesis of all those two things. And you need to do all of these things to understand it, which is the Hermetic, which is the true mysticism. The book is the tradition. It's the synthesis and the child of the other three. But you have to do this because it's the epistemic principle, because you need the certainty of rationality at the same time as well. You don't need it. You'll have the certainty of, which is directly transmitted to you, which we'll go into in the next slide. You'll have that certainty, but also of knowledge too. And this comes into what are each of these things if they're taken on their own. Mystic touch or mysticism on its own, if that's the only thing you do, leads to intoxication, leads to, well, not intoxication necessarily, but eventually, because you need to know and understand what's happened. You need to know what's going on and to think about it. And that's what the purpose of Hermetic philosophy is. To understand the mystical things that occur, to be the master in the chariot who's not outside in ecstasy, but is awake. At least later as well, to understand it at the same time, to have all four of these things together. But if mysticism on its own, a spiritual drunkard is what you will end up being if you just do that. Or that's the threat anyway. The Gnostic on its own is dealing with the dead spirit of religion, because you need this direct spiritual touch. It actually brings about the rest. And in a practice, if you just focused on the visual element, that's eventually that has no ground. Its ground is that point of potentiality which you attend. Eventually, it becomes available as something you can attend, and phenomenologically, let's say behind the eyes or around the brow. Again, it only becomes available as you've gone into the practice. But if you just attended what was visual, eventually that has no ground. And so that's the dead spirit of mysticism. You need all three for it to be connected to the roots of Yod, the roots of the divine. If you don't have the roots, you've just got the trunk of the tree. And the trunk of the tree, if you cut off the roots, what happens to the trunk of the tree? it dies, right? It's the leftovers, and it just becomes a intellectually stimulating affair. And that's what, Crowley and stuff are involved with, just Gnosticism. If you're just doing magic or just doing divination on its own or whatever it is, which some of these people were involved with, like Eliphas Levi, but they eventually realized that they wanted the direct, true experience of the Christian God, and walked away from those court magics and ceremonial magics and those sorts of things, which, when they're not connected to the roots, what they are is end up being a aesthetic romanticism, or just a sort of low sorcery, which is grasping around in the dark and doesn't have this certainty and doesn't have this faith, because that requires mysticism, which is the ground of all of it, which grants direct certainty of episteme and has God with you as a raw fact of your being. And so that's the problem with that. And what's the problem with just dealing with Hermetic philosophy, or just dealing with philosophy, as I talked about a bit earlier, is that it's intellectual jugglery. You become someone who just has a lot of intellectual fireworks. And this is almost everyone who talks about philosophy. You're like a dude playing with Lego bits, rearranging something that someone else maybe saw the ground of. You don't deal with essence. Mystics deal with essence, the what of things. You're dealing a bit back with the bark. If you're dealing with the bark, the sort of dead tree, the technical dead propositions, and rearranging them rather than going to the essence and ground of things. And so it's intellectual jugglery, and it becomes a sort of charlatanism. And you are a charlatan because you don't have the raw experience of truth. So how do you know what truth is? You can use rationality. Yes, you can debate things, but most of these people end up polemicists rather than people who are deeply engaged in the truth of things. People who are deeply engaged in the truth of things don't tend to be polemicists. Even though we need some of those people on our side of those things, I love those people that rely on and find the truth of what has been revealed by our theologians and the Orthodox Church and such, and debate those things. That's so important. But the theologian in the old sense had the true experience. He's not getting involved in polemic only perhaps after he's been so developed in his, had the raw experience of truth and of God, that he can go and have those polemics without being affected by it. It's a different type of energy. And so, again, I have to go to the bathroom again. I drank too much tea. So I'm just going to put some nature vibes on. I'll be back 2 secs. I suppose we could also talk about the Hermetic epistemic principle, because it's relevant to this. And you can kind of see, we'll talk about it now. You can kind of see how that works with these 4 different senses. The epistemic principle relates to experiencing all these different senses to confirm it. But with the Hermetic philosophical sense, it's not just a thing that's confirmed by what you see. You have, of course, the certainty of authentic faith, but you also have the certainty of knowing as well, because part of the epistemic principle is to compare it to revelation and theology. It's not going to be inconsistent with that. It's not what Gnostics do. It's going to be consistent with revelation. It will only deepen it in terms of deeper understanding of whatever these things are. Again, that's why new saints emerge, because they have a deeper understanding of things. That continues. But yeah, it's not going to be inconsistent with our understanding in Christianity. That's an important part of it, using Hermetic philosophy to do that and compare it. But also, of course, these other senses are involved. Does it bear fruit in your life? Does it transform you towards the good and the Lord? Does it draw you to the Lord? Does it have these raw, factical miracles start to occur towards the good? Is it transforming you? So that's part of the magical sense. Are you able to collaborate with something outside? Not just mystic experience and hearing and communication. And I think something I didn't really talk so much about in the other slides is when you're dealing with and working, that's such a stupid word. Even collaborating, they're so dry words, and because it's such a meaningful, you're dealing with a father that's more fatherly than your mortal father, and mother that's more motherly than your mortal mother. The Lord, as an empathetic, direct relationship and collaboration, I can't remember why I was bringing that up, but the point is it's the most meaningful thing. That's it. Imagine doing these practices like the yogis to have the certainty of something moving your breath or whatnot, and knowing it's the Lord, because you've had certainty transmitted to you, because you've used and compared it to revelation, because you've used the whole Hermetic epistemology, but mainly because you've been granted faith. Authentic faith is something that's granted. And grace becomes available as revelatory action. As St. Paul said, it's not I who live, but Christ who lives and acts in me. Acts through me. Collaboratively, like the breath, right? So if you're in a practice and let's say the Lord speeds up your breath, compare that to a Wim Hof who's just doing it from some technique. You're trusting this mortal rather than what is talked about in the temperance chapter of Meditations on the Tarot, which is you're dealing, at least at first, you're dealing with your guardian angel. The divine knows the exact amount of breath you need and dosage, you could call it, or whatever. And that's the Lord knows also the limits of what can be granted to you in terms of knowing and revelation based on your moral development. You're putting yourself in his hands in this, and that is nothing more meaningful thing to have that relationship and seeing it bear fruits. And you're not doing it, right? It's not the Übermensch. It's the outside time that's doing it. It's the divine that's doing it. And so that's what keeps you humble, because you've got a growing certainty and a growing understanding until eventually you have the objective meeting with these beings, with Christ, Mary, or a saints that you're involved with. They start off as sort of indirect influences and forces and things that you can see in active imagination, right? And that becomes more and more focused until an objective meeting occurs. And then megalomania is not possible. When you have met something that is far above you, that inflation thinking you're God or Christ or something like that, like what happens with cultists, is just not possible because you've met beings. It's impossible after that. I haven't experienced that part of it, like the objective meeting, but everything below it. But it's not possible. That's the Christian esoteric view. So, yeah. And I've got a video on the Christian Hermetic epistemic principle. Criterion for truth is what that means. I've got a video on that. You can look at that in... I could go bring it up now, but I'm not going to bring it up now. Let's go next. Okay, something that might help understand this is kind of connected to with Heidegger's thought on language as the house of being, or the structure that holds being as a whole, like language is. And you could think about it like revelation. Written divine law is the house of the oral law. Oral law, the second hay of YHVH, is the house of the voice that whispers. And what's the voice that whispers? Voice that whispers is miraculous, isn't it? It's the child of Yod and Hay. The voice that whispers, again, and when you're dealing with Christ and revelation and the divine, when they speak, they don't bowl you over. It's Lucifer that bowls you over. Sometimes that can occur, but it's very rare. It's measured with your moral development in mind. But when you seek to go through these, and not if you seek this experience to feel better, rather than for truth or just for a deeper relationship with the true and the good and the beautiful, which is the Lord, rather than having a deeper relationship with the way, the truth and the life, if you seek it for going in and because you want to feel better, you'll get that, but it won't be him. It'll be the Luciferic, because the Luciferic is about that. It's about checking out. It's about the truth doesn't matter. You'll bend towards that in illusion. And we know this from the saints talking about the phenomenology of it. We know this from them talking about the phenomenology of the devil, like I've talked about before. That bowls you over, but it leaves you without warmth. You can tell there's a warmth missing, and we'll talk about what that warmth is in terms of the phenomenology. There's that warmth missing. And so I just wanted to articulate that point, is that it doesn't bowl you over. When you are spoken to, and I'm sure Christians are watching this, will have experiences of this. When the Lord has spoken to you, it's always very subtle. The voice that whispers. Christ is a mystery. Christ, he will talk to you and speak to you in ways that you won't predict. He's fundamentally outside time and outside knowing, all human knowing. He'll always do things that you can't predict. But he will answer your prayers, but not necessarily in the way that you want him to. And so, yeah, the voice that whispers, the vow, is the house of the son of Mary, right? It's from Sophia, Hay, the second Hay of YHVH. And that's thought as in capital T. If you look at yourself as the microcosm, your thinking, the words, the propositions in your mind are the house of the thought, capital T, being your non-likeness being. But it is, you can see that as the active imagination. If you do concentration exercises, you can see it as a whole, and that's what you are. So that thought or being as a whole applies to creation as well, the whole thing, which is Sophia. That's the thought, which is inside the house of the voice that whispers, Christ. Christ goes through Mary to enter the world. But he is he is connected, begotten by the Father. That thought is the house of divine wisdom, Yod, outside. Like I talked about earlier, the Yod in the Hebrew alphabet is a miniaturized version of both the other letters that looks like the same in a miniaturized thing. It goes down and across and then down again. And a vowel is sort of down. And you can see across it's like the horizontal. The hay is kind of a horizontal and a down, which you could see is the receptive as a horizontal. Anyway, we won't go into that. Point is, it's a point of potentiality. You can actually feel mystically, by the way, once you've developed these things. And we'll describe that in a different way later as doxa, dianoia, episteme, and theurgia are related to these four things as the Greek words that relate to concentrated thinking, rational thinking, concentrated thinking, episteme, thought as a whole, knowledge as a whole given, and theurgia, this mystic touch. Oh, that's the next slide. Imagine that. Okay. And so you can see here, more stuff. Okay. So now let's go into some of these experiences, which we've sort of talked a bit about already. And these terms are the terms of Saint Teresa, I think of Avila, the way she describes them, but they're related to how Christian esotericism talks about it. But There are three types of this experience: transsubjective, extrasubjective, and a synthesis of those two things. So the transsubjective is, like we talked about, it's like mystic touch. It's outside of your soul faculties. It's the vertical, not the horizontal. The Gnostic sense, or the extrasubjective, is the horizontal as the past. It's once it's entered memory. It's like the direct. Okay, let's just talk about the transsubjective first, though. So the transsubjective is characterized by when you, and Saint Teresa talks about this, is that she has the certainty and knows, well, she says sees, but not with sight, and not even with incorporeal sight, not even with Gnostic vision. She just sees with the certainty of something that's uncreated, unseen. And this might be thought about like the language of angels. It's the direct certainty, infused certainty into your being, at the ground of your being, at the very bottom. So it's before it can become a factical phenomena. It's at the ground, and so you just know that the Lord is next to you. That's as St. Teresa talks about. Doesn't see it, and that's will be characterized as the most pure experience you can have, a certainty. Just knowing. The lesser experiences, which the Orthodox Church don't take the next one, the extrasubjective, which is the Gnostic, in terms of seeing it, that can be sight, hearing, any of those things related to something at a distance. Particularly the visual. The Orthodox ignore all that completely because it's too much of a risk. The purists, they consider it too much of a risk. So the purist version is that intellectual vision. It's just the direct certainty that Christ is there. And that's on the vertical. And so after such a thing becomes, as we know in the practice, enters and becomes memory, because it's a point of potentiality like we talked about, that certainty and knowing that someone's there then becomes Gnostic in terms of words. But it's in that potentiality already as mystic touch that we sort of talked about. But again, when using her terms, intellectual vision isn't actual vision. It's just a certainty of, well, she characterizes it as sight, but without sight. So certainty that I see, but I don't see. Now, I've had that. I had plenty of that experience as certainty of that center certainty, but not as certainty as seen. That doesn't make sense to me exactly, but that might be just a level of, in terms of relationship with Christ. Of course, she's a saint. I'm not a saint. Yeah, so that's what that's characterized as. And so on the horizontal, the extra subjective, it's once it's entered memory, right? So again, you can consider that like the Gnostic sense. Hearing, movement, visual movement, breath. And the third type is both of those things. So Valentin Tomberg characterizes this as the fire of a mouse, the road to a mouse. You know, when Jesus, our beloved Lord, resurrected, he met with the disciples on the road of a mouse. And they said, did our hearts not burn when he spoke to us? And so it's a synthesis of both those things, and it can be characterized by warmth and this growing, but a certainty of something outside of you, and you know 100% is not you. And even logically, it makes sense based on your interactions with these beings, with Christ, as a response to something you've said, let's say, in the practices. But it's sent as certainty, of the certainty of faith, which I talk about in that video of the Hermetic epistemic principle.
It's infused certainty, but it's also warmth at the same time. And so the depth of this warmth and the depth of, again, it's not like normal, it's not normal emotion. And it gets endlessly, almost endlessly distinct in terms of different things, different beings, let's say. And noticing the difference between, it's part of also noticing what's illusion and what's true and what's not. It's a developing discernment to something like we talked about earlier with Satan. He comes and bowls you over with some intellectual experience or something or some vision, but it's lacking, again, this, you have the discernment to know what isn't the Lord. That's what develops, though, and you don't have that at the start, and that's why Pythagoras even talked about that too with his acolytes, and that they were silent for the first 5 years of initiation, and that's because you need to develop that discernment. But yeah, the depth of that, and as you go through the experience, things make more and more sense to you, what the alchemists talk about, like the feeling of the Lord, like Quicksilver. But I won't go into the phenomenology of that until I know a better way of talking about it. But yeah, that's the difference between those two things and their synthesis. And you can see how that's connected with subject and the object we talked about earlier, or enstasy and ecstasy, and how these things are connected, and why one is outside time and one is to do with memory. It's already come inside as that point of potentiality. And you can see here too how they're related to the Greek terms doxa, dianoia. And you kind of start with, this even shows you initiation. Doxa, objective consciousness, opposition of subject and object, the opinions and ideas, which relates to the symbol of pentacles and coins, by the way. But you start with that, and that's kind of like the preparation in initiation. When you're reading the philosophers, you're reading Heidegger, you're reading theologians, you start you're reading Valentin Tomberg, let's say. People ask for a book list. That's someone you should certainly read, Valentin Tomberg. Meditations on the Tarot. Again, that's not about the tarot, it's about initiation. But yeah, so, and through dianoia, which is concentration without effort, which purifies you, which the sword is related to purification, which we know the 3 steps of initiation are, or 4 steps being preparation, purification, illumination, union. And so dianoia is related to purification, which is related to, the swords. Episteme, intuitive consciousness. That's when illumination comes. And so you might consider that like, as it says here, 3 leads to inspiration, hearing. Spiritual hearing, though, meaning visions and what is Gnostic, right? And so you might even consider how that's connected with the point when I talk about in the practice of initiation, concentrating on a point, but also the all. And so you're sort of doing that, and this being that you are is disconnected from everything is sort of, I don't know, expanding and aligning, and through that purification and concentration with the 3 oaths and through forgiveness and with all the other things that are related to Christianity that have to go on at the same time, you can see how each thing expands to eventually lead to, through concentration without effort, through all those things, through episteme and Gnostic experience. Again, the reason why you remain silent until you can experience a mystical touch or spiritual touch. With theurgia, that's, everything is a spectrum. It kind of leads, every little thing you do is related to everything else you do in initiation. And so these things are experienced at once too. It's not like, it's not cut off in a certain point where it's, okay, purification's over, this is over now, this is over now. You'll experience things and then realize what they were long after by going through this process of the Hermetic epistemic principle, by making sure you do the work so you understand what you've experienced. You have to understand what you've experienced to move further. It's part of illumination. It's part of understanding. So anyway, that's about the end of it. But it's also related to Christ's passion and also his miracles, which we'll talk about in the next stream, I think. But foot washing, just as a preview, foot washing can be linked to concentration without effort, that dianoia. But it's not done by you. It's done in collaboration. And so what you learn from that and meditating deeply on Christ's passion is that the higher serves the lower and the Lord serves you you can't change what's at the depths of your being in the unconscious. That's why so many people go to therapy and all this demonology, because there's things that you can't change, but he can. And in collaboration with him, he'll serve you and his angels will serve you if you begin these practices. And so that occurs. You begin to establish contact with him. You begin to grow wings of the will. Instead of being aimed at the temporal, they are establish contact with the eternal. You don't grasp. You don't reach before the master. You don't reach before the Lord. He collaborates with you. He draws you up. But you have to do your part, but he draws you up. You're not a yogi. You're not an ubermensch, which an ubermensch, what happens to them is they're a Tower of Babel that gets smashed to pieces eventually. And so that's partly, because again, when it comes to Christ's passion, nothing is ever extinguished. Any little thing that you might be, that seems like a weird narrative thing. I can ignore that. No. When it comes to John's gospel especially, or all of the gospels, these things are never extinguished. They are deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper meanings. And the mission of expanding them is always there. I won't ever extinguish any of this stuff. You will know a deeper way of thinking about this. And you are always required until the end of the earth to help. There'll always be a new thing that's needed for the spirit of the times, because the spirit of the times is Aramanic and Luciferic, and you always draw more depth out of such things because this is the ground of existence, and that can never be extinguished and brought in totally into human knowing. So there will never be a cease to the quest of people being involved with this and delving further and deeper into it. And so your journey just begins where my speaking leaves off. And so if I seem to be speak in a way that's, I've explained it and this is it, that's it. No. These things have more and more depths endlessly, especially when it's to do with this. And so the foot washing is that. And thank the Lord that such a thing is possible, because you couldn't do this. You couldn't go through this initiatory way before Christ came. So be thankful to the Lord that you can go through such a thing without whatever the pagans did for their initiation. It was objective. It was from, there was the rituals of death, but I'm pretty sure it still came from acolytes outside helping the person. Rudolf Steiner describes a bunch of different procedures that they went through. But yeah, initiations changed since Christ came, and things have opened up that you can do that you couldn't do before. And through that concentration without effort, the next step, and this is a Christian esoteric understanding of these things. You might disagree, that's fine. But the scouring, what happens when you go through this process, it's not all Christ's way is difficult, but his yoke is also easy. He'll guide you very slowly through these things. But what happens here is the Aramanic and the Luciferic, the left and the right hand, the yappiness, things that were subjective and didn't come to the surface are brought to the surface, and you're tempted by them. And so that's part of the scouring, is that you have to, because you're being risen to your higher being, higher self, and towards Christ, these things will try to pull you back down. And so it's an important part of your moral development to deal with these things. It's because you have to, Christ is the ground of your being. He wants you to make the decision. He doesn't want to possess you and take over. That's the will to power. That's subterranean forces that want to just possess you and completely take over. He wants to collaborate with you. He granted you freedom for a reason, so you can make the decision. Homo provoked or homo logos. It's up to you in collaboration with him. He's not ever going to take over your consciousness and just act It's always going to be with you and freely chosen. So the scouring, you have to deal with sins. All these tendencies that you had in you will rise up, and you go, wow, I'm doing the practices and these bad thoughts come to me, just will to power thoughts and wanting to conquer or whatnot. It's because he's working in the very depths of you, and these things come up that you have to work with, again, by asking for forgiveness and by blessing others and by forgiving others is part of the way you do it, but also resisting the temptation, knowing it. And that's what part of what mastery is that the two horses that are in front of him on the chariot are yes and no. You're a master of yes and no, but he's the true master. He's always ahead of you in initiation, always. If he wasn't, then if you obliterate that, you just don't have a relationship with Christ or higher beings, and you become megalomaniac, like we were saying. And the crowning of thorns, we won't go into the further detail of that, but we'll go into that next time. But let's have a look, see if anyone has any questions.